Paul says as much in 1 Corinthians 15. He says that Jesus rose from the dead in much the same way we will rise from the dead. And then he goes on to explain what kind of bodies we will have when that day comes. He talks about earthly bodies and heavenly bodies and says the glory of the heavenly is one thing, that of the earthly is another. He uses the metaphor of a seed that may be planted as some small, dry, brown thing, but come up as a grain of wheat, a stalk, or some other grain. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. He says what is planted is perishable. What comes up is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. It is this glorified spiritual body Paul seems to have in mind when he talks about the first fruits of those who will rise from the dead, Jesus, as if we can expect to have a resurrection body much like His, one that defies all the usual rules of earthly existence, including that annoying rule about having to die someday. No more, Paul says, not when you have been raised. I've tried to imagine the difference between the earthly body and the spiritual one, and for reasons that perhaps only my mother would understand, I keep thinking about comic strips. Comic strips. Most of the comic strips these days just try to be funny, but there was a time when some of those strips told a story that continued from day to day, just like a little soap opera there in the newspaper. There was Mary Worth and Judge Parker and the girls in apartment 3G. Just ordinary people living out their everyday lives, except these people were living in a comic strip. I've tried to imagine what it would be like to bend over the newspaper and explain to Mary Worth that there was a world outside her comic strip she couldn't begin to imagine. A world where people walked around in 3 dimensions instead of 2, where along with length and breadth there was also this wonderful thing called height. I would have to explain that to her. But it would be hard because I would be speaking to her from another dimension, from the 3rd dimension, and she just wouldn't get it. Not only that, but she wouldn't see me. How could she? I would be above her looking down, and in her world there would be neither up nor down, but only always sideways. But what if I could become 2-dimensional just for a little while? What if I could enter Mary Worth's comic strip world and teach her about the 3rd dimension? And what if she began to get it, that there is a world of not only length and breadth, but also height? And then suppose I said to her tenderly, Mary, I can't stay here any longer. I'm going to have to go back to where I came from. But if you are ever looking for me, all you have to do is look up. Does that sound familiar to you at all? Does it sound anything like what Jesus said to His disciples, including Mary Magdalene? Don't hold on to me, He said. I am ascending to my Father and your Father, my God and your God. I am ascending. Going up, going back to that dimension from which I came. It reminds me of that passage from Philippians 2 where Paul says that Jesus, who was in the form of God, emptied Himself in order to be born in human likeness. Maybe what He emptied Himself of was that extra dimension. And maybe when He rose from the dead, He put it back on again. If so, then you might understand why His disciples had trouble recognizing Him when He rose from the dead, just as Mary Worth would have trouble recognizing me in my 3-dimensional form. She might say, you know, you look a whole lot like comic strip Jim, but you're not, are you? You've gone back to the way you were before. Maybe this is what Paul means when he talks about our glorified spiritual bodies. Maybe he means bodies that have entered the divine dimension, where there is not only length and breadth and height, but also something else, something that we can't even grasp in a three-dimensional world. Maybe what it means to exist in that dimension is to be set free from all the constraints of time and space, so that instead of only being in one place at a time, you can be in every place all the time. I've thought about that as I have looked at this Sunday's lesson from the gospel, from the book of Acts. Paul on the road to Damascus. You know that story. There he is, walking along, breathing threats and murder against the church of Jesus Christ, when suddenly a bright light from heaven falls around him, knocks him to the ground, and a voice says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" "Who are you, sir?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Things were never the same for Paul after that. Not only was his name changed, his life was changed. Instead of persecuting the church, he began to preach the gospel. Years later, when Paul described that experience, he described it as an appearance of the risen Lord. In 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about all those people Jesus appeared to after his resurrection, Cephas, and then the 12, and then 500 people all at one time, and then to James, and then to all the apostles, and finally, Paul says, as to one untimely born, he also appeared to me. But it's not the same as his appearance to all those others, is it? In those other appearances, Jesus stands before his disciples, shows them his hands and feet. In Luke's gospel, he eats a piece of broiled fish in front of them just to convince them that he's really alive. How could Paul's experience be described as an appearance of the risen Lord? It was a flash of bright light that knocked him to the ground.